What if there was a gospel that had the potential to reshape our understanding of early Christianity, and it was wiped out? This would be the right time to imagine entering a dark room, the smell of antiquated parchment filling the cracks of the place. Dusty corners house a tattered assortment of ancient scrolls, their edges worn thin with the passing of aeons. There is candlelight, and a scholar unrolling a manuscript, tracing letters written centuries prior. His breath catches. These words, these illicit words, tell of a divine mystery that history has lost. Now picture that same textual material disappearing, its teachings judged to be dangerous, its very existence considered a threat. Once studied, now deemed heretical. A manuscript containing secrets of faith, salvation, and the divine, erased, buried, and removed from the eyes of the world. This is not simply about one lost document. It's the story of how history is made, not only by those who put pen to paper, but by those who determine what ought to be purged from the record. A common human experience over the ages has been fascination with the unknown. We yearn for secrets, forbidden knowledge, whispers of truths that were never to be divulged. From forgotten scrolls of ancient civilizations to literary tomes incinerated for their content, history is dotted with missing pieces. Puzzles that, if unlocked, could alter everything we know. But why are we so captivated by lost knowledge? What sort of books are we searching for? Books which were never meant to be read. Stories which were meant to be buried. Why is the answer simple? The missing knowledge is the missing power. If something was hidden, erased, or destroyed, it surely threatened somebody, somewhere. And in the case of religious texts, the stakes are even higher. Because when a holy text gets obliterated, it's not just a book that disappears. It's an entire outlook on life, a way to reckon faith and divinity that's wrenched from the universe. And this is exactly what happened to the Gospel of the Egyptians. A text that existed, that was debated and discussed in the early centuries of Christianity, yet ultimately erased from history. It was not added to the Bible. It was not passed down, as the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were. It turned instead to a whisper, to a shadow, to a mystery buried beneath centuries of religious decisions. But why? What was so dangerous about this gospel? Who decided it didn't belong? And most importantly, what if its message was never meant to fade? A gospel that defied the norm. The Gospel of the Egyptians was different than the four canonical Gospels we see in the New Testament. It told a different story, offered a different picture of Christ's message, and brought forth ideas that did not fit the new architecture of early Christianity. This gospel was a struggle for early Christian leaders. Some saw it as sacred, as a text full of divine wisdom. Others saw it as threatening, too mystical, too radical, too foreign. And at a time that was still shaping Christianity's identity, anything that didn't conform to its official doctrine was discarded. As a result, this gospel was lost. Or so the plan went. Because despite efforts to forget, pieces remained. We see glimpses of what it might have contained in these scattered references in the writings of early Christian scholars, and in their death knell, ideas that turn the story we've been told on its head. Coaching me, words that imply a greater cryptic faith. What if this gospel was part of the Bible? How different would Christianity be if that had happened? To comprehend the erasure of the Gospel of the Egyptians, we need to go back in time, to a period when Christianity wasn't yet a single faith, one unvarying story, but a phenomenon that had many voices, many interpretations, and many clashing beliefs. In the first couple centuries after Christ, groups of Christians disagreed on his message. Some of them saw him divine since his birth. Others thought he was divine much later in his life. Some were hard and fast rules, others were freer, more mystical, spiritual interpretations of God. And at the center of this theological battlefield were the scriptures, the sacred texts that would eventually form the basis of Christianity. But not every text was embraced. Some were selected, some were denied. And those that didn't align with the official version of Christianity, they were condemned. One such text was the Gospel of the Egyptians. But what was so threatening about it that the question remains, why was it dangerous enough that it had to die? And had its message survived in good form, how would it have altered the way we uncover the very nature of Christianity today? The story of a gospel that was never intended to be lost. A once heretical text, hidden, all but lost to the ages. But history has shown us that lost knowledge has a way of reappearing. And sometimes what is forbidden once is the most true of all. The Gospel of the Egyptians is one of the great religious enigmas of history. A lost text, once shared by early Christians, but later eradicated from mainstream religious texts. So before we get on to why it was hidden, we need some context of where it came from. Who wrote it? Where did it come from? And perhaps most importantly, what was so different about it compared to the Gospels preserved in the Bible? Most historians place the writing of the Gospel of the Egyptians around the late 1st century to the early 2nd century AD, a pivotal era in the life of Christianity. And for most of this time, the body of believers was in a state of flux, with no unified version of the faith. Various Christian sects and sects with different understandings of Christ's instruction sprang up. These groups tended to adhere to the teaching of Peter and Paul that stressed faith, salvation, and organizational aspects of the church. The others had a higher concept of understanding Jesus and viewed his words as cryptic, affirmation of secrets given to only a few. This Gospel of the Egyptians was of the second type. Whereas the New Testament Gospels were obsessed with the story of Jesus' life, his miracles, and his crucifixion, this text explored divine secrets, esoteric teachings, and spiritual mysteries. The Gospel of the Egyptians is mentioned in the early church by Clement of Alexandria, an early Christian scholar and theologian active in the late 2nd century. Clement was a philosopher and a teacher who sought to reconcile the religious and philosophical worlds. Unlike some of his contemporaries, he didn't simply throw out all the texts that were not in the canon. Instead, he read them and explored their teachings. Clement wrote about the Gospel of the Egyptians, but he was referring to a text used among a strand of Christians who believed in secret knowledge. That raises a critical question. If the Gospel of the Egyptians was once so widely circulating, how did it disappear? The reason relates to its key differences with the canonical Gospels and what early church leaders thought about those differences. The 4 New Testament Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were chosen because they fit into a coherent narrative of Christianity. They portray Jesus as the Messiah and the Son of God, who fulfill Old Testament prophecies and established a new religious movement. The Gospel of the Egyptians focused on spiritual enlightenment rather than events in history. Others say it included Gnostic ideas, beliefs that exalted inner revelation over outside religious authority. This was viewed as a challenge to the burgeoning Christian church, as it implied that salvation did not need a church hierarchy, but rather could be achieved through an individual's own comprehension. The authentic Gospel of the Egyptians is still unknown. This text lacks a specific name attached to it, unlike the New Testament Gospels, which were traditionally attributed to disciples, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What we do know, however, is that it wasn't intended for the general public. It was composed for a select group of believers who believed themselves to be the guardians of divine truth. The idea of secret wisdom was also central to Gnosticism, a religious movement that arose at roughly the same time. According to Gnostic Gospels, the truth about God and salvation couldn't be found in churches or religious institutions, but rather as a result of a personal journey of enlightenment. This concept undermined the authority of the religious leaders. If people could find God without mediation, then why needed priests, bishops, or church doctrine? The 2nd and 3rd centuries saw Christianity moving from a loosely organized and diverse way of life to an organized religion with defined dogmas. Leaders such as Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Clement of Alexandria believed Christianity needed unity, and that to achieve that unity they had to determine which texts were divinely inspired and which were dangerous distractions. The Gospel of the Egyptians was among the latter. There was too much mysticism, too much secrecy, and too much independence from the rising power of the church. It had the dubious distinction of being deemed heretical. Some were too corrupt to salvage. Others were simply left to rot in the libraries and desert monasteries of history. The tale faded over the years from history, only briefly brought up by some scholars such as Clement. But was it truly erased? The Gospel of the Egyptians did not disappear entirely, however, despite the church's efforts. Ironically, small pieces and allusions were preserved, in some cases buried in the writings of early Christian scholars. But when the Nag Hammadi library was discovered in the 20th century, it was clear many so-called heretical texts had been stashed away in secrecy. What wisdom did the Gospel of the Egyptians not see as the wise word of God? What made it so dangerous for the church to keep? And if we had the full text as it exists today, should we change our understanding of early Christianity? But as we seek to discover the truth, we're led to the key question of all. What exactly did the Gospel of the Egyptians say? Picture an evening long ago at an ancient family gathering where Jesus and select followers are present and fielding questions. One such is Salome, a person largely forgotten in mainstream Christianity, but assigned a dramatically significant role in the Gospel of the Egyptians. It was a trick of the eye in that room, the flickering light of an oil lamp on the stone walls. And she said in tones half curious, half frightened, "How long must death have power?" It is not a simple question. It is a question of existence itself, of suffering, of the unavoidable fate of humanity. Her words brim with the weight of human mortality, birth, suffering, death, an endless cycle. And then, Jesus going in, his response, not a word of comfort, not a word about resurrection, but a response that would shake the foundations of faith itself. As long as women are giving birth, silence follows. The disciples exchange confused looks. What could he mean? How could birth, an event revered as life itself, be the very thing that enables death to continue? Whether at hand, and to those putting to paper these words centuries after, this statement work challenges all. It hints that the material world itself is the ill, that to be born is to be shit out into some kind of feedback loop, an infinite cycle in which suffering is a given. And so to escape death, you must escape this world altogether. This teaching contradicts the doctrine of resurrection proclaimed by the early church. Rather than salvation through faith, the Gospel of the Egyptians presents salvation through flight, from the physical world, from the cycle of life and death. It tracks with a Gnostic worldview, which considered the physical universe a kind of prison, dominated by inferior, malevolent spiritual forces. This was dangerous to early Christian leaders. The church had started to establish itself as the road to salvation, promising eternal life through the sacrifice of Jesus. But if true salvation came through knowledge, through understanding the illusion of the physical world, what need was there for priests, for rituals, for the increasing edifice of religious authority? The ramifications were explosive. This was more than a theological dispute. It was about power. If people thought they can find the enlightening on their own, so why would they follow the church? Who would obey? Perhaps this is why Salome's role in traditional Christian texts was diminished, why this gospel, one that gives her a voice, was buried. For embedded in this conversation is something deeper than a differing belief. It offers the opportunity to topple the very notion of religious manipulation. But that was not the only radical idea in the Gospel of the Egyptians. There was another idea, one that the church found even more disturbing. An idea that spoke not only of what God says, but also of what God does not say. The idea of divine silence. There is a soft, waiting silence in the atmosphere. Not the absence of sound, but something deeper. A silence that speaks, starts not with the voice of an almighty creator, nor with the commands of God written on stone. Instead, it speaks of divine silence, a God who does not dictate laws or intervene in human affairs, but who exists beyond all comprehension, beyond all form, beyond all language. For those who heard this idea for the first time, it was both liberating and troubling. The God of the Gospel of the Egyptians was neither the God of Genesis, who formed the world by his hands, nor the God of the Old Testament, who spoke through fire and thunder. This was a stranger God, a God of words that could contain and yet could not contain him. Only a God who could be fully known through soul-crushing spiritual realization. This was a direct challenge for early Christian leaders. They founded their doctrine on the realization that God had spoken through the prophets, in scriptures, and ultimately through Christ. But if God was indeed unknowable, if he transcended human comprehension, what was the role of religious authority? If the absolute truth could not be set down, then what was the true power of Scripture? It undermined the very foundation of the church. It meant that it's not adherence to dogma that leads to salvation, but personal revelation. It meant that no priest, no bishop, no institution could be a gatekeeper to God. And this was just the last radical teaching in the Gospel of the Egyptians. But there had been another idea, an even more dangerous one that did not just challenge doctrine but the very structure of the church itself, a different Trinity, a Father, a Mother, and a Son. Christianity holds that the Trinity consists of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and is at the heart of Christian theology. But the Gospel of the Egyptians offers something other, something the early church fathers could not abide. In this case, the Trinity was noted as Father, Mother, and Son. Having the Mother as a visible figure in the hierarchy of the divine organization was a bit of a surprise. At a time when spiritual authority was primarily exercised by men, this gospel proposed that the divine could be understood not only as masculine, but also feminine. It was an indication of a balance, a duality within God that had disappeared from mainstream Christianity. In Gnostic traditions, divine wisdom, Sophia, is tagged with this mother figure in this text. Sophia, unlike the passive role assigned to women in many early Christian writings, was a muse of knowledge, enlightenment, and liberation. In some accounts, they even refer to her as the one who helps humanity get out of this material world and leads lost souls to the true world of God. This was a dangerous idea to the church. If God was both male and female, then the entrenched religious hierarchy, one in which men were ultimately in control, could and should be scrutinized. If the Divine Mother was equally involved in creation, then what about how women were positioned in spiritual leadership? These were questions the church didn't want believers to ask. These alternative ideas were systematically erased as Christianity evolved. The divine feminine had been obscured or reinterpreted in ways that reinforced male authority. "You are from the time before." The divine Sophia had to be silenced. Any gospel that explained such things was called heresy. But there was one more idea in the Gospel of the Egyptians, one that would separate it even further from the fold of Orthodox Christianity. It spoke of aeons, repressed spiritual forces, and a totally different way of thinking about the universe. One of the main reasons as to why this text ultimately disappeared from history were these teachings. The first few centuries of Christianity contained great diversity. They were marked by controversy, by power struggles, by rival ideologies, a contest between rival readings of Christ's teachings. The conflict was fundamentally about the fact that you had two very different forms of Christianity, both of them claiming to be the authentic picnic of Jesus. On one side was Orthodox Christianity, the ordered faith that would later undergird the church. It emphasized faith and obedience and salvation through Christ, with a well-defined hierarchy of priests and bishops who would lead the faithful along the path to divine truth. On the other stood Gnostic Christianity, a mystical, esoteric tradition that perceived spiritual enlightenment not as something offered up by the church, but rather something individuals could attain themselves. This loquacious hidden tradition included the Gospel of the Egyptians. It wasn't a narrative gospel like Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. It didn't just follow the life and miracles of Jesus. It offered instead a radically different vision of salvation, one based on hidden knowledge, gnosis, self-discovery, and spiritual awakening. It did not offer salvation through faith alone. It demanded inner transformation, an escape from the material world, a penetrating knowledge of divine mysteries. This idea was dangerous to the emerging Orthodox Church. Christianity was developing, diffusing in labels across the Roman Empire, and growing as an ecclesiastical order. It required unity and clear doctrines and centralized authority. The church was also beginning to solidify its teachings, specifically regarding how salvation was attained only through Jesus' sacrifice and the authority of the church to dispense and deny that saving grace. But Gnostic Christians believed that they didn't need priests, bishops, or any institution to reach divine truth. Each individual had the potential to connect directly with God. This was a grave challenge to religious authority. Without church approval, salvation was impossible. Then what ultimate power did the church really possess? If divine wisdom was no longer under the purview of religious leaders, who determined what was true and what was false? The Gospel of the Egyptians and other Gnostic texts were chaos for the ones who hold the power. They urged believers to look outside of the scriptures, to look outside of the institutions, and beyond the dogma sanctioned by the religious authorities. And this was something the church could never allow. With the fight between Orthodox and Gnostic Christianity raging, any and all text that could potentially undermine the authority of religious power was silenced and eliminated. The Gospel of the Egyptians was declared heretical and condemned by religious authorities and ultimately eliminated from formal Christian teaching. But the contest was far from decided. One of the most vocal opponents of Gnostic teachings, and the man who would have a huge hand in deciding the future of Christianity, was a powerful church leader named Irenaeus of Lyons. Christianity was experiencing rapid growth by the late 2nd century, yet its followers were scattered and fragmented into opposing theologies. Of these divisions, none were so contentious as the Gnostic Christians, whose teachings undermined the authority of the church directly. Over the centuries, however, the Gnostic texts, such as the Gospel of the Egyptians, alarmed church leaders, and thus they were disregarded, cataloged as a potential threat to the very foundation of the Church of Christ. The towering figure among them who most vocally opposed the Gnostic version of Christianity was the church father Irenaeus of Lyons. Gnostic beliefs were not just different to him, they were dangerous. He perceived them as a danger that could splinter Christianity before it even had a chance to congeal as an organized religion. Irenaeus believed that the Gospel of the Egyptians, like other Gnostic writings, perverted the precepts of Jesus and misdirected followers. Determined to address that, he took action. Irenaeus produced a lengthy 5-volume text titled Against Heresies, which was a direct assault on Gnosticism. In this major work, he denounced the Gospel of the Egyptians and other related texts as false teachings intended to mislead Christians. The Gnostics, with their supposed secret knowledge, did not provide salvation, he said. Salvation came through faith in Christ and a belief in the Church's doctrines. But his battle was not only theological, it was one of power. Christianity remained a new and evolving religion in the Roman world at this time and was struggling for legitimacy. The Church also wanted to establish a common doctrine for credibility and faced opposition from new Gnostic Christian ideas that militate against this. The belief that people could find God without the Church's guidance challenged the religious hierarchy directly. If people believed that they didn't require priests, bishops, or official scriptures to connect with God, what authority did the Church genuinely have? As time went on, the Church took decisive action against Gnostic sects. Their lessons were declared heretical, their followers were banished, and their texts were banned. Those who maintained such alternative beliefs faced persecution, suppression, or went underground. With the rise of orthodoxy and its absorption by the Roman Empire, Gnostic concepts were increasingly oppressed and systematically eliminated. The Gospel of the Egyptians and other texts that undermined the Church's expansive power disappeared from history. It wasn't lost by accident. It was scrubbed intentionally. But was this gospel actually heretical? Or perhaps it was something else? An artifact from Christian history that was buried because it threatened religious authority? The answer lies in the tale of its suppression. A tale not only of faith but also of political ambition, theological antagonism, and the fight to control the truth. By the 4th century AD, the essence of Christianity had changed dramatically. Once persecuted, it was now a burgeoning force in the Roman Empire. But with power also came a demand for order, unity, and control. The existence of different versions of Christianity, each with its own texts and teachings, was a direct threat to the Church's burgeoning authority. The body of this struggle was a question: which version of Christianity would be the official one? The answer was determined at one of the seminal meetings in Christian history, the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, called by the Roman Emperor Constantine. This was no mere theological debate. It was a political play, aimed at creating a single, cohesive doctrine that could be compelled throughout the empire. The Roman Empire had a real interest in a tidied, ordered, obedient to authority kind of Christianity. As political instability caused religious chaos, Constantine understood that a disunited Christian faith could undermine the empire more than strengthen it. At the time of Nicaea, church leaders could decide what would be deemed true Christian teaching and what would be labeled heresy. These choices would have implications for Christianity for centuries to follow. One of the texts that didn't make the cut? The Gospel of the Egyptians. The other teachings were mystical and emphasized divine silence, and they contained a mother figure in the Trinity, all completely incompatible with the version of Christianity the churchmen wanted to found: a Father, a Son, and a Holy Spirit. The official Christian doctrine needed clear, defined beliefs, not a secret God veiled in silence, not a goddess or divine feminine energy, not a salvation attained by personal enlightenment. For the church, these thoughts were too dangerous. If salvation were about personal knowledge and not faith in the teachings of the church, then there would be no need for priests, bishops, or even the church. So the decision was made. Some books would be kept, and others would be deleted. The Gospel of the Egyptians, along with many other Gnostic writings, was classified as heretical. What becomes of heretical books? They are destroyed. The vote at Nicaea laid the groundwork for one of the largest book purges in history. During the subsequent centuries, church authorities initiated a campaign to eradicate dangerous, including the Gospel of the Egyptians. But how does someone wipe a gospel clean? How does one make a whole belief system vanish? Throughout the empire, religious leaders called for the burning of heretical books. Libraries that housed alternative Christian texts were raided, their scrolls and manuscripts reduced to ash. Abstract. Just as the hands of the Roman government shadowed the devout, so did the hands of the Christian bishops cover the teachings of Christianity. Any community that kept using banned texts was declared heretical, and its members were persecuted or exiled. This was not merely a theological rejection. It was a war on knowledge. It was a calculated effort to eliminate rival versions of Christianity so that only one, the church's version, would endure. But not all accepted this new arrangement. In hidden nooks and crannies, far from the gaze of church authorities, some believers could not let these lost gospels vanish completely. They knew that a book may never be unburned, but if just a single copy had survived in some hidden place, the truth could survive. Once the Council of Nicaea had established the dividing line between orthodox and heretical teachings, the second wave of erasure began, a systematic purge of forbidden scriptures. The Gospel of the Egyptians, like so many other Gnostic texts, was now designated as a dangerous and corrupting influence, a direct threat to the unity of the church. But how do you unwrite a gospel? Church leaders ordered the destruction of texts that contradicted the newly established doctrine across the Roman Empire. Bishops and Christian authorities led efforts to burn heretical manuscripts wherever they found them. Libraries that contained alternative Christian writings were raided, their scrolls turned to ash. This was more than an effort to suppress ideas. It was a campaign to rewrite history itself. Whole communities that refused to renounce Gnostic teachings were branded heretics, their members persecuted, exiled, or even executed. The aim was explicit: eradicate every form of Christianity that did not conform to the church's official teaching. One event associated with this purge is the destruction of the Great Library of Alexandria. Historians still dispute the precise details of its collapse, but there is widespread agreement that Christian authorities helped purge texts that conflicted with the new religious hierarchy. The demise of this enormous storehouse of wisdom resulted in the permanent loss of numerous philosophical treatises, Gnostic texts, and alternative Christian documents. But to the church's great consternation, not everyone complied. Some would not let these lost gospels fade away. Did this gospel survive among hidden Christian sects? The Gospel of the Egyptians was such a threat to the church that they sought to eliminate it, but all was not lost. In remote monasteries, secret underground enclaves, and covert gatherings, some Christian sects embarked on the dangerous endeavor of safeguarding and excerpting these prescribed texts. These groups, labeled heretics, believed the authentic message of Jesus was being expunged, and it was their responsibility to preserve it. They thought they were safeguarding a deeper truth, one the church wanted exhumed. Centuries later, they finally began to see the fruits of their labor. In 1945, in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, something astonishing was discovered. The collection of ancient manuscripts included long-lost gospels that were never accepted by the church and were long presumed to be lost forever. Among them were many of the very writings the church had decreed heretical, buried for nearly 1,600 years. Among them also were Gnostic writings, whose themes resonated with those of the Gospel of the Egyptians, of mystical knowledge, of a hidden God, and of a way to salvation not dependent on the authority of the church. The Gospel of the Egyptians was a powerful text, probably only lost because it was erased from history, but its loss is a powerful reminder of an uncomfortable piece of truth. History is written by the victors. The version of Christianity which won out was the one with the backing of emperors, bishops, and councils, not necessarily the version represented in all its aphoristic glory by the early Christian writings. The surviving books, the deemed official doctrines, and the teachings that shaped the face of modern Christianity were all chosen carefully, while heretics were silenced, outlawed, and forgotten. The Gospel of the Egyptians was not merely a lost book. It was a murmured idea, an unmarked history, an alternate trajectory that could have transformed Christianity. But the most haunting question lingers. If this gospel had survived, if it had been canonized, included in the Bible, how different would Christianity look now? It was just another day in December in 1945 when a poor Egyptian farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman embarked upon a task that would inadvertently change history. He and his brothers weren't looking for treasure or lost wisdom. They were digging in the hills around Nag Hammadi, Egypt, prospecting for something far more practical: fertilizer. But what they uncovered under the sandy surface was something much more precious. When Muhammad Ali's shovel hit something hard, he stopped. Taking an interest, he and his brothers dug up a large clay jar tightly sealed and buried underground. For a second, they considered smashing it. Local superstitions warned of ancient curses, spirits or jinn that could be unleashed on those who dared disturb them. The hope of hidden gold was far greater than the fear. Gold did not spill out. Instead, the jar had books with leather-bound covers, old dusty things with a stange writing on papyrus pages so fragile they threatened to break if breathed upon. Baffled and disappointed, Muhammad Ali and his brothers collected the books and took them back home. They did not realize that they were holding something that had been lost for more than 1,600 years. In the weeks that followed, some of the pages were ripped apart, burned for fuel, or tossed away. Others were cut up and sold off to traders. It was only much later, when the ancient texts ended up in the hands of scholars, that the full significance of the discovery became apparent. Muhammad Ali discovers what subsequently would be called the Nag Hammadi Library, a find that would prove to be one of the most groundbreaking in the study of early Christianity. When historians and religious scholars finally gained access to the texts, they were astonished. These were not your ordinary Christian writings. They had been different, and on which history had been expurgated. Within the works at Nag Hammadi, scholars discovered Gospel of Thomas, a writing of Jesus' secret sayings, which for the most part were never included in the New Testament. The Gospel of Philip. This text spoke of deeper, mystical teachings, even implying a different relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The Gospel of the Egyptians, an enigmatic gospel that spoke of hidden knowledge, divine silence, and the secret way that lay beyond conventional Christianity. These texts turned everything people thought they knew about early Christianity on its head. They told of another Jesus, another salvation, another God reality, about grace in a backstreet alley and sacred wisdom known only to an in crowd. For centuries, the belief that only the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, contained the real message of Jesus had prevailed among mainstream Christianity. But these texts that were missing told another story. They pointed out that early Christianity was much more diverse, full of competing ideas about God, salvation, and the point of life. It was clear that these texts had not just been forgotten, they had been actively erased. After the First Council of Nicaea, in 325 AD, fathered a cohesive, state-approved Christianity, the individual and his identity became seen as threats by the Church. This included any texts that undermined church authority, encouraged individual spiritual exploration, or undermined the role of priests and bishops. Many were burned or banned, or just hidden away, fading from history. But here they were, rediscovered in the Egyptian desert centuries after the fact, in a jar that had been buried by someone who may have gambled their life to protect them. Muhammad Ali al-Saman did not know that the books he discovered contained banned knowledge, buried since the days of the early church. He never expected that they would ignite a worldwide debate among scholars, theologians, and historians about the true nature of Christianity. But even as these texts were scrutinized, one lingering question: were they authentic transcripts of early Christian teachings or treacherous misinterpretations of the truth? The first time scholars saw the Nag Hammadi texts, they realized they had found something amazing. Intimate knowledge, gnosis, became the basis of faith and instructed followers to find divine truth within rather than relying on religious authorities. In fact, this gets in the way of a rigid hierarchical structure of the church, because salvation was a personal journey and not controlled by priests. A feminine aspect of the divine was recognized and honored within her, a complementary force of the patriarchal religious traditions that postulated early Christian thought. God was not limited to rigid definitions, but was a mysterious, unknowable, or divine force greater than human comprehension. What if these ideas had been allowed to breathe? Would Christianity be a faith that centered on people, that empowered people, instead of an institution designed only around doctrine? Would they have seen spirituality as a personal experience rather than something dictated by religious authorities? The gospel was suppressed, not only for theological reasons, it was power over truth. Any belief system that fostered spiritual independence and called into question the authority of the church would have threatened the early church's authority. And so, it was erased. But the ideas of Gnostic Christianity never died, despite centuries of suppression. Rather, they re-emerged again and again through medieval mystics, Renaissance thinkers, and even modern spiritual movements that subvert traditional religious orders. But this raises a much larger question. If these teachings had been preserved, would they still hold relevance in the world today? The revelation that was lost in history is still encoded in the Gospel of the Egyptians message, a call for spiritual resurrection and mysteries that we will rediscover as the wisdom of the ages. In a time where organized religion is challenging itself, personal spirituality is on the rise. The very concepts this gospel promoted are being reconceptualized. For centuries, conventional religious institutions determined faith via dogma, rituals, and external authority. But today we are transitioning from doctrinal faith to mystical faith, moving from blind faith to personal experience of the divine. The growing popularity of meditation, mindfulness, and mystical traditions suggests that many are searching for inner exploration as opposed to rigid religious structures, a concept that dovetails nicely with the lost teachings of this gospel. Were the Gospel of the Egyptians to survive, it could have mapped a different Christianity, one without institutional power to sustain it, as if it were to concentrate instead on The individual's spiritual awakening is prioritized over religious authority. Priests, smack your clerical lips, a direct communication with the divine, no intermediaries needed. That is, the striving after hidden meaning rather than taking scripture at face value. A balance of the masculine and feminine divine published instead of a patriarchy. Reverberations of a forgotten gospel in contemporary life. Though this gospel went up in smoke, the concepts behind it never really faded away. Instead, they reverberate in the myriad of contemporary spiritual movements that seek to replace traditional religion and institutionalized belief. These days, people find meaning via meditation and inner reflection, somewhat similar to the Gnostic philosophy of self-discovery and enlightenment. Spirituality, blending Christian mysticism with Eastern philosophies like Buddhism and Hinduism, not the distant ruler that the Old Testament presents, but the God that dwells within all things. That leads to an interesting question. Should Christianity have been about the personal and mystical journey and not the established faith with rules? If so, why was this take kept from us? Yes. It matters that this gospel was deemed heretical and eradicated. It indicates that those in power knew they had the ability to destroy ideas as well as preserve ideas. If knowledge is power, then knowing what people believe is one of the most effective means of maintaining religious and political authority through history. Were we deprived of a view of Christianity that set people free instead of shackling systems? Has a filtered or controlled version of spiritual truth been all we have been served? And if so, what else have they hidden from us? Had this gospel survived, it might have changed the face of Christianity. But instead, it was stifled. But no matter how long it was falling from grace, its core message nevertheless remains relevant to those seeking a more intimate, personal God, even in the face of centuries of repression. History has erased the Gospel of the Egyptians, another sacred text exterminated by the Church's unyielding effort to control Christian doctrine. But was it truly erased? Or did its message live on in ways we never fully understood? While the physical copies of this gospel were methodically obliterated, ideas are much more difficult to eradicate than manuscripts. The central tenets of this lost gospel, personal knowledge, esoteric wisdom, and an intimate relationship with the divine, re-emerged throughout history in countless new disguises. These ideas have been quietly influencing spiritual movements, mystical traditions, and alternative forms of Christianity, all resting just below the surface of religious orthodoxy. With the advent of the Middle Ages, a time when religious orthodoxy ran rampant, various forms of Kramer-era mystical Christian sects began to emerge, practicing beliefs that mirror those in Gnostic writings. Like the Cathars in France, the Bogomiles in Eastern Europe, and the Brethren of the Free Spirit, all preached that the material world was an illusion and that salvation was granted not through the Church's doctrine, but through the realization of an esoteric inner knowledge. One of the beliefs of the Cathars was this idea of duality. The material world, they asserted, was the creation of a false god, and true divine essence could only be realized in spiritual enlightenment. This is not far removed from Gnostic teachings, which often depicted a more incomprehensible God who is hidden in the world and a world itself that deceives those caught in it. The Church viewed these beliefs as a direct threat to its authority, labeling them heretical and engaging in bloody crusades to eradicate them. Yet even as the Church sought to erase these alternative paths to divinity, they endured. Much of this mysticism went underground, transmitted illicitly through esoteric societies, alchemical traditions, and later through even Renaissance thought. They did not call themselves Gnostic, but their spirit was still there, ideas of self-discovery, divine wisdom, the rejection of blind obedience to religious authority. Even now, echoes of these ancient concepts come to life in various spiritual phenomena. Many themes from Gnostic teachings can be found in modern mysticism, esoteric Christianity, and even New Age spirituality, often without people realizing their origins. The practices of meditation, praying from a place within that calls God for wisdom, and straying from religious institutions look eerily similar to the teachings in the Gospel of the Egyptians. What if, rather than losing the Gospel of the Egyptians to the dust of history, it lived on in the hearts of those who would not let it die? If so, where else might its power be lurking? Oh, and how many of us today are unwittingly living by teachings that were once deemed too dangerous to be allowed to exist. The church may have obliterated the Gospel of the Egyptians, but ideas, particularly those based on deep spiritual truths, tend to have a life of their own, a tendency to survive even in the shadows. How can something as great as divine wisdom ever be completely erased? Or does it simply find new ways to manifest itself, lurking in unlikely pockets, anticipating its renaissance? Over centuries, occult brotherhoods pass on a perspective on mystical teachings that resemble the Gnostic creed that church authorities racially targeted. These groups were often driven underground, but they maintained influence in ways that challenged suppression. Some had secluded themselves in underground communities, verbal traditions that had passed on knowledge by whispers and symbols, while others had hidden their wisdom in the labyrinths of art, literature, and spiritual practices. Was the hidden gospel being perpetuated by the very people who were seeking the fullness of divine truth in these underground movements, or were they simply isolated systems of belief? The Renaissance, for instance, when esoteric knowledge came out of the shadows. As they studied ancient texts, scholars, mystics, and philosophers found buried wisdom hidden beneath centuries of religious control. Some of these writings repeated ideas of divine wisdom, personal know-how, and God beyond human ability in echoes of the Gospel of the Egyptians. These radical ideas challenged conventional doctrines, claiming that salvation lay not within religious institutions, but existed in personal exploration and the journey towards individual truth. The notion that true knowledge, or gnosis, is the key to enlightenment was repeated in many lost and forbidden writings apart from the Gospel of the Egyptians. What if these teachings never actually disappeared? What if they had been kept in secret, continued from generation to generation by those who were not willing to allow them to vanish into obscurity? Many unknowingly hold beliefs in line with the lost gospel still today. Much of modern spirituality is permeated with ideas reminiscent of Gnostic thought, the notion that the divine is outward, not inward, not through religion. The notion that spiritual enlightenment must be discovered by the individual, not by dogma. The idea that there is hidden knowledge beyond what can be found in standard teaching materials. A view of God above dogma. A God who is simultaneously beyond words and intimately known. Because these ideas aren't just ancient texts or whispered in secret religious cults. They have seeped into modern psychology and self-help philosophies and into contemporary religious thought. The idea that real change comes from the inside, that each one must find one's own way to understand the universe, is not new. It's ancient. The lost teachings echo through mystical traditions the world over, from Kabbalistic Judaism to Sufi Islam, from Eastern meditative practices to esoteric Christianity. Most people today, including many who would consider themselves religious, unconsciously practice concepts fitting the Gospel of the Egyptians. When we talk of finding God within, when we seek wisdom beyond the limits of institutions of religion, When people meditate seeking higher consciousness, we are engaging with the very concepts that were the last ones that were ever tilted with danger in thinking or existence. But if these ideas once posed such a danger that they had to be wiped out, what does it say that they resonate today? If there is anything history has taught us, it is that the truth always comes back, no matter how prevented na Lyubov. Ideas that challenge power are often labeled as heresies, but they tend to survive, sometimes in surprising places. Why do these lost teachings continue to resurface time after time in various cultures and epochs? Were we always meant to find them again? Or did those in power know if we accepted such knowledge, we could no longer be under their control? Maybe the Gospel of the Egyptians was never really lost. Maybe it was just biding its time until the right moment and the right people would rediscover its truth. History has taught us over and over again that what is erased is not necessarily lost. In turning to these lost Gospels, we can glimpse the whispered truth about Yeshua, about the relationship we were actually meant to have with him. These Gospels, buried under centuries of religious repression and error, were condemned, but never destroyed. Their kernel of inner wisdom, of divine connection, fragmentary though it may be, grows beneath the surface throughout the centuries, never to be completely extinguished. And so they survived, in whispers, in secret traditions, in modern-day spiritual beliefs, waiting for the few who are willing to seek them out. But what made these teachings so dangerous? Why were they considered heresy and erased from history? And the answer is power and control. If people came to believe that they could attain salvation through enlightenment, not through religious institutions, then the power of these institutions would also erode. The Gospel of the Egyptians, like so many other lost scriptures, wasn't simply a religious text. It was a challenge to an entire system. And yet, in the face of centuries of suppression, these ideas have emerged, time and again. The question isn't too much whether they were erased, but why do they keep returning? Maybe truth, as deep as it is buried, always floats back to the surface. The story of the lost gospel is not merely history, it is awakening. It is about challenging the data we are fed and exploring the hidden wonders of reality. What other truths have been kept from us? What has been knowledge kept almost hidden? And more to the point, who profits from leaving us in the dark? We can think of lost scriptures as part of a bygone age, but what if they still have something to teach us now? Maybe these texts are not really about informing us, but inspiring us, awakening something in us. Turning to the Gospel of the Egyptians, this documentary has examined the repressed history, secret knowledge, and buried truths of this lost scroll. The journey is not over yet, though. What do you think? How relevant might these lost teachings still be in our modern world? Even though we're kept away from spiritual truths that have the potential to completely transform the way we understand reality. Need more context and news analysis? Tell us what you think in the comments. All views are welcome. Whether you agree or disagree or have your own theories that you want to share, your voice is part of the continuing search for truth. If history has taught us anything, it's that nothing remains in hiding for long. Secrets have a way of finding their way to those ready to uncover them. Maybe the Gospel of the Egyptians was never really lost. Perhaps it was waiting for the right moment, waiting for the right people. When I need you to ask the questions no one else will.